Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Does Europe have a distinct position on the major issues of the Middle East, and is it really united in the stand vis-à-vis Iran, Syria, and other foreign policy security concerns? This question poses itself especially following last week's G7 summit that provided a forum for world leaders to debate their various positions. To discuss European foreign policy and security amid an apparent increase of divisions, we are joined here in the studio by Ambassador Ayalon, who is Israel's former deputy foreign minister and ambassador to the United States. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is a political scientist at Bar-Ilan University and the president of NGO Monitor. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding with regard to Europe and its various divisions at the time, of course, before Brexit in October and other challenges that it is heading towards.
As our audience knows full well, there was a time long ago when Europe was not only the center of the world, it was the world. And every other place was measured by its distance from Europe, be it the Near East, the Far East, the New World of the Americas, and
the first world, the second.
Now, and then came the two world wars, which devastated Europe, and with the rise of the United States and the Asian powers, we have reached the position where we are, where there is hardly any one Europe. We have the continental Western and somewhat Central Europe. We have Eastern Europe, the former satellites of Russia, the Soviet Union, now members of NATO and of the European Union. And we have Great Britain, the United Kingdom, which is about probably to break away from Europe. So if you don't have one single European entity, European identity, can you have a single foreign policy vis-à-vis the Middle East or any other place? Now, if you look at the books, you still have the so-called quartet, the four members of the international framework for dealing with the Middle East, including the United Nations, the United States, Russia, and the EU. But the EU is right now in a process of changing of the guard, with Federica Mogherini in her last weeks in office. We don't know what will happen with the new people in Brussels and whether they can all have one single policy regarding the Palestinian-Israeli issue and perhaps more germane right now, the Iranian issue.
Ambassador Ayalon, when we're looking at the European Union for quite some time now, the three main countries, the most powerful in this bloc of 28 member states, were the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. These countries, even though the rest of the members did have an equal voice to a certain degree, of course, they were the ones who called the true shots. Now, just heading before the Brexit, where the United Kingdom, one of those major powers, moves out of the European Union due to its nationalistic aspirations, we have somewhat of a division of sorts with regard to various challenges. Nevertheless, we do see some kind of unity or remnants of unity on other specific issues, but the national interests of each member state is more and more brought to the forefront as the key element of what countries seek to persist in, rather than the bloc identity.
Well, Jonathan, even in the heydays of these three major European powers, they still had some, I would say, complexity in trying to convince the other member states. We have to remember, decisions, by the charter of the EU has to be unanimous. And once they became 26, it was much, much harder to get unanimity, especially with the Eastern European countries who had some other interests. Usually those countries, namely Germany, France, and England, used to actually exert economic pressure on the others. but not so much anymore. First of all, they're all immersed in their own political agenda. As you mentioned, Brexit is something that consumes the entire energy of the government of Britain and the entire political echelon over there. Germany is also on the cusp of changing leadership. And Angela Merkel is almost, she is on the way out. They have these issues of immigrants. And then you have France, and Macron and France always had this grandstanding. We see the grandstanding now, and Macron, as the host of the G7 was, I don't know if it was with coordination of the US or without, invited Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, and now he's trying to negotiate and broker a meeting, a summit between Rouhani, the president of Iran, and President Trump during the General Assembly of the UN, September in New York. But this is more, I would say, issues of ceremonial. I don't see any effect. I don't see any gravitas in this in Europe today. Not vis-a-vis Russia, not vis-a-vis the United States, not even vis-a-vis China. And we see it also that they pretty much are quite withdrawn when it comes to the political process between us and the Palestinians, which of course doesn't exist, but you see that they are hardly heard. Also, I think there's issues of personality. I think the last serious and recognized and respected international, let's say, leader of the European Union was Javier Solana, which was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. He had some gravitas. After him, including with Mogherini, they were not taken too seriously. All told, I would say that Europe is pretty much on the sidelines on many, many issues. And as I look, forward looking, I'm afraid you look at the fundamentals. I mean, forget about politics now. The fact that the European Union, demographically, are shrinking, which means at some point their growth, economic growth, will shrink, and which will affect, of course, their currency and anything that comes out of it. I think they will continue to be on the sideline unless there will be a major shift, which is very hard to see.
Professor Steinberg, how do you view this current situation?
Carrying on from what Danny said, and Amir also, I want to emphasize the way that the EU and also in most of the foreign ministries and leadership of those countries, they talk about soft power. Europe, they say, is soft power oriented. It's not military power. They reluctantly and marginally participate. Britain is separate, but the rest of continental Europe, what we used to call old Europe, Western Europe, before expanding towards the East, and I'll get back to those divisions in a minute, they invested very heavily, both, I would say, politically, psychologically, in soft power versus hard power. And they saw soft power as a means of exerting European influence. And that has caused a lot of damage. They talk about common values. They're very politically correct. Part of that was also a form of their own national interest. And we recently saw documentation of what we already knew, that back in the days of President Mitterrand of France, in order to avoid terror attacks, Palestinian PLO, we're not talking about Hamas, we're talking about PLO, Arafat terror attacks, they bought off the terrorists, they bought off the Palestinians. And part of buying them off was also to invest heavily in what they called soft power in the both in the Paris or before the Venice Agreement of 1980. They bought into what they call the Palestinian state. Now we call it a two-state solution. So Europe invested very heavily in what I would say, in a critical way, is the myths of a Palestinian state, the myths of human rights and democracy as being the basis for an agreement, the myths that they will provide lots of funding to civil society organizations, NGOs. The way that Europe has the greatest influence, and its negative influence in the region, is through funding a lot of these very marginal non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are basically anti-Israel. Under the framework or the heading of soft power, of human rights, these are groups that promote the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian mythology. Israel is very powerful. Israel needs to make concessions to the Palestinians in order to solve the conflict. These myths are very deeply ingrained. They're deeply ingrained in the the foreign policy establishment that Mogherini ran. I think it will continue exactly as it has been, because that's what all of these bureaucrats, all of these diplomats, academics, that's what they were all brought up in. Now, I think one of the differences that perhaps provides a way out of this in the long term is that the Eastern European countries, the New Europe countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, all of those, they reject that perspective. They understand that the use of soft power and NGOs is a means of manipulating, including in their own countries. So they object, and you see a lot of coordination. There are points of friction, but also coordination. There's a common interest between Israel and those countries to, I would say, if I would use it directly, to break apart that dominance of that old Europe, those old mythologies, to force some new thinking. Their ability to influence, for the reason that both of you discussed earlier, their ability, because they have limited resources, they don't have the economic clout, they don't have the deep historical clout within the EU to influence policy, it's a slow process. But I think that we may be seeing some changes in that and breaking up, but slowly understanding that the old myths and the old soft power political correctness approach doesn't work, and it's time to stop.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to continue in this line of discussion and hear what you have to say about this, but I would like also to bring into the picture the recent meeting between the Finnish foreign minister and his Iranian counterpart, Mohammad Javad Zarif, at a time when Finland is right now the periodic president of the European Commission. We could hear that even though the E3, Germany, France, and Great Britain, have come up with somewhat of a vehicle, a trade vehicle, in order to try and bypass the U.S. sanctions on Iran, called Instex. The various European countries of the European Union do not necessarily want to become part of this for fear of falling under U.S. sanctions. We could hear the Finnish foreign minister saying specifically that they are currently reviewing and considering becoming part of this Instex mechanism. Nevertheless, it indicates again that Europe is not united on its decision-making with regard to foreign policy, specifically when it comes to security and various challenges.
Well, Finland, of course, has historically been a very important source of peacemaking. Sometimes it was fruitful, sometimes futile. For instance, in recent years, on the nuclear issue, a Finnish mediator was appointed trying to bring Israel and the Arab countries together. Hasn't worked out yet, not through any fault of his. The E3, which you mentioned, the big three of Europe, were brought into the process by Israel some 15 years ago. This is how the whole process, which led to the joint comprehensive plan of action signed or agreed to 4 years ago, started. Israeli diplomacy led by the foreign ministry, which Danny has been part of, by people like Ambassador Shimon Stein and others. This was how it all started, and therefore they had a stake in the success of this process, regardless of what other members of the EU say. Now, Danny mentioned Javier Solana. Before Solana was the foreign policy chief of the EU, he was the Secretary General of NATO. And while both of these organizations reside in Brussels, Schuman, which is where the EU is headquartered, is less important to Israel than King Leopold Boulevard, which is outside of Brussels and where NATO is headquartered. NATO being, of course, Europe plus the United States and Canada, also Turkey, which is not part of the EU, but military power and not only political power. And one last point on that. President Macron of France has been quite important vis-à-vis Lebanon. Lebanon, hosting Hezbollah, is one of Israel's main security concerns. France, as a historical patron or matron, as the case may be.
Specifically of the Christian Maronites in Lebanon.
Specifically of the Christian Maronites, and they hold the presidency and the command of the military, even though, of course, other ethnic groups or religions hold the speakership and the prime ministership. But nevertheless, Macron has told the President Aoun and the commander of the military, who is also an Aoun, he told them that Israel is serious in its resistance to what Hezbollah is trying to do. So even though this is not EU, this is only France, but France, as was said here, along with Germany, is an important co-leader of Europe. This is a positive contribution to trying to get the Middle East away from big trouble.
Not to forget that also in Lebanon, the second most spoken language is French. Ambassador Ayalon, on the same line of thought, how do you see the European Union so divided, yet so eager of establishing certain facts on the ground that would allow them to move forward? For instance, the rejection of Berlin to join the U.S.-led coalition in the Strait of Hormuz, of course, the naval task force in order to assure maritime or freedom of maritime navigation, and at the same time hearing the foreign minister and also the German chancellor talking about the fact that they would consider a European naval task force, but of course a naval task force from Europe is something that will take a while, and they were very vocal about knowing that fact.
Well, John, I would say there is a tug of war within the European Union and also, of course, between Europe and the United States. We have to remember that the paradigms, or the two paradigms that the European always abided by were, and this is why they're being so lenient towards the Arabs, were their dependence on oil, and also trying to shy away from terror. Well, the entire energy landscape has changed now, with Norway, the Northern Sea, and of course other countries. And secondly, we see that the terror hit them anyway. So today they should be less of, showing consideration to Arab interests, although the Arab interests today are not the Arab interests of the 70s, 80s, or 90s. So in a way, by them debating whether or objecting to join a universal maritime force led by the United States is against the interest of the Sunni countries. And I'm sure that they will not be able to really withstand Sunni and Arab pressure for too long. I don't think that the European force isolated from the United States or Canada or other maritime is viable. I think it's just a matter maybe of some negotiation or some bravado, which has no merit and has nothing behind it. Also, and if Germany and other European countries, France, are not joining, Britain for sure will join an American naval force.
France has already indicated that it is willing to join.
Exactly. So I think it may be some negotiation, some kind of maybe saving face, but at the end of the day, they have no choice but to follow the U.S. lead, also in the Straits of Hormuz.
Indeed. Professor Steinberg?
I'm a little less optimistic than Danny about Europe on getting realistic. The world's largely, when we teach politics, international relations, we divide those who have a realist view of the world, which is really European-based. It goes back to the Bismarck-Castlereagh back 200 years ago. Kissinger brought it to the United States, or emphasized it in the United States, and the idealists. The idealists who imagine a peaceful world where soft power is dominant and the need to use military force. We can talk to the Iranians. So we had this tour, this photo op tour of Mr. Zarif, who went from Sweden, Norway, Finland, all getting his picture taken. And they were all the foreign ministers and the political leaders were talking to him about ways to reduce the possibility of conflict, to repair the joint program, the JCPOA, that was agreed to back in 2015, and the Iranian and the nuclear program, all those things. This belief in this, I would say, naive view that diplomacy being nice can solve everything. So I think that that's so deeply rooted. We talked about Finland, and I know some of the Finnish diplomats, and there are real divisions within Finland. There are people who have a realist point of view. They're sitting right next to Russia. There's Putin. There's a long history there. But there are also those who bought into the European mythology. And there's a major program in Finland, peacemaking, the crisis, I think it's called the Crisis Management Initiative. One of the most well-known Finnish diplomats, Matti Ahtisaari, runs this institute. And they recently had a scandal. They had somebody who they hired who's a very, very closely connected to the Palestinian terrorist or framework and very hostile to Israel. Someone who thinks Israel shouldn't exist. And he was working for this crisis management initiative, which is so important and gets a lot of European funding. And I'm just using that as an example to say how deeply rooted this perspective on the world, that if we're just nice to them, they'll be nice to us. It's going to be very hard. It's not just that the diplomats have to make the decision. In the case of France, I can imagine that Macron would say, yes, we should join this multilateral initiative led by the United States to keep the Gulf open, to allow oil to flow. And I can imagine not just the yellow vests, but large numbers of protesters in the streets of France, just as we saw in the UK. Tony Blair, when he brought the British with the United States to fight in Afghanistan against the bin Laden Taliban group, and back in now we're talking about 30 years ago, and then later on in the case of Iraq, and there were millions of people in the streets. That's not going to change in Europe very quickly. This image that if we're just good, if we're just pacifists, if we just go for soft power instead of hard power, we can solve the world's problems. The anti-Americanism that's deeply built in, that's all part of that European culture, which I just don't see changing in the near future.
Less than 20 years ago, with regard to the Afghanistan operation.
You're right, 20 years ago.
Mr. Owen?
Coalitions are very, very difficult to manage, to lead, and obviously sometimes it's an alliance such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Sometimes it's what Rumsfeld called the coalition of the willing. And Europe is an alliance within an alliance. If the United States wants to lead a global alliance, it must first look at Europe and ask Europe, have you put your house together in order? Because if you pick up the phone, whom do you call? The German Chancellor, the British Chancellor, the French President? Can they coordinate among themselves? So it's very difficult, especially when President Trump has chosen to fight with them on several issues. At the same time, he wants them to help him on other fronts. And he doesn't want to deal. For all of his self-reputed deal maker, the art of the deal, he doesn't want to give way on any issue. So they resent it, and they are not helping him. And if you look at the State Department website, they have a clock there regarding sanctions on Iran and on Iranian officials such as General Soleimani. And they say, a year from now, a year plus a month, plus a week, plus a day, plus an hour, these are all going to expire. Please help us, because either at the UN Security Council, you must have other votes, or at least not to have vetoes. And in other places too, you can't fight it alone. And there's a lesson there for Europe as well as for the Americans.
Nevertheless, we need to keep in mind that not all 28 member states of the European Union are resentful towards Trump. You have the Eastern Bloc of the European Union that is actually very favorable towards Trump and has had also this nationalistic or rightwards in the electoral power bases within those countries.
But they are not senior or major enough to
Correct.
take part in the G7, for instance.
Correct. Nevertheless, we now have also, since Theresa May is out of the picture, and we have now Boris Johnson, and ahead of the Brexit with a big trade deal looming between the United States and Great Britain, there's a lot of favor within the office of Johnson towards the Trump administration, with the hope of course, making the ultimate deal for the two countries. I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Ayalon, with time actually about to run out for this program, to what degree do you see the European Union or Europe at large actually waking up to the current reality with so many dynamic and shifts within international affairs that one cannot just stand by their current thoughts of how to deal with everything and just need to be pragmatic in every step and step?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about that. I think there is a lot of stagnation in Europe, not just in the economy or demography, also in the political thinking. And in a way, you can go back. I know it's very common to compare and to the 30s. Until they were hit by the head. Hitler, starting the war against or invading Poland, they didn't wake up. It took Churchill and it took the UK. So I'm afraid if there's no calamity or some kind of disaster, they will continue with their own ways. There are too many moving parts. And I would say that especially with the younger generation in Europe, they're pretty much withdrawn. They do not see themselves as a global power, and they don't want to hear about any problems.
Professor Steinberg?
I'd like to disagree to make it interesting, but unfortunately I agree with everything that Danny Ayalon said, and I think it's even worse when I go to universities in Europe. First of all, invitations to speak publicly to an Israeli who's not anti-Israel in his policies, who criticizes Europe, very, very difficult to do in any kind of European framework. Perhaps if I'm looking for a point of optimism, maybe Boris Johnson and Brexit is a big wake-up call for them. Among other things, also if there's going to be an oil crisis, if they can't get their oil from the Persian Gulf coming in, all sorts of things could happen. So it'll take perhaps a generation, maybe 10 years, but there are going to be a number of shocks to the system that the Europeans are going to have to take into account and change their mythologies.
Mr. Oren?
In the longer term, or at least 10, 15 years from now, the problems are going to be China and Russia. And Europe will have to decide whether they are with the Russians and the Chinese, or are they with the Americans and the West in general.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Ambassador Ayalon for being here today, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Steinberg. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.